The distant clatter of wagon wheels against hardened earth masked Elizabeth Roseworth's desperate gasps as she stumbled forward, her legs threatening to betray her with each laborious step. The Nebraska Territory stretched endlessly before her, an unforgiving expanse that had already claimed so many dreams and lives during the summer of 1859. Just a little farther, she whispered to herself, the words barely audible as the merciless afternoon sun beat down. Her once pristine blue dress now hung in tatters around her ankles, stained with the red dust of the trail. The wagon train had continued onward hours ago, leaving her to catch up after she'd ventured off to collect herbs near their last water stop. She'd never imagined the distance would prove so treacherous, or that her canteen would run dry so quickly. A buzzard circled overhead, its patient dance a grim reminder of her predicament. The prairie grasses swayed in a gentle breeze that brought no relief from the heat. Elizabeth's vision blurred, the horizon tilting as she placed one foot in front of the other, determined to reach Lincoln, where a teaching position awaited her. After losing her parents to influenza back east, this opportunity represented her last chance at building a life for herself. "Keep moving," she urged herself, though her parched lips had begun to crack, and her heart hammered violently against her ribs. The world spun once, twice, then went black as her knees buckled beneath her. Quentin Irving adjusted his worn leather hat, squinting against the harsh glare of sunlight reflecting off the plains. From atop his dappled gray stallion, Storm, he surveyed the barren landscape, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. At 32, he had spent nearly half his life traversing these territories, driving cattle from Texas to Nebraska, fighting off rustlers and weathering the unpredictable temper of the frontier. The cattle drive had gone well this season. His men were camped 10 miles back, celebrating their success with whiskey and cards, but Quentin had ridden ahead, preferring the solitude of the open trail to the raucous revelry. Something about the quiet expanse of prairie always settled his restless soul. His horse nickered softly, ears pricking forward toward something in the distance. Quentin's hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his hip, a habit born from years of vigilance. But as he narrowed his eyes against the sun's glare, what he saw wasn't a threat but a crumpled figure on the ground, a splash of blue fabric stark against the golden grass. "Easy, Storm," he murmured, urging his horse forward at a cautious trot. As he approached, Quentin realized it was a woman. She lay motionless, her chestnut hair spilling from beneath a simple bonnet, one arm stretched forward as if she'd been reaching for something in her final moments of consciousness. He dismounted swiftly, his boots landing heavily on the packed earth. Kneeling beside her, he gently turned her onto her back. She was young, perhaps mid-20s, with a delicate face now reddened from sun exposure. Her breathing was shallow but present. "Miss," Quentin tapped her cheek lightly. "Miss, can you hear me?" When she didn't respond, he retrieved his canteen and carefully trickled water between her cracked lips. Some dribbled down her chin, but she reflexively swallowed, a good sign. A quick assessment told him what had happened: exhaustion and heatstroke. Her clothing suggested she was from back east, likely unprepared for the harshness of prairie travel. No wagon or horse in sight meant she was alone, separated from whatever group she'd been traveling with. The nearest settlement was Lincoln, just over 20 miles away. Quentin glanced at the sky, calculating the hours of daylight remaining. He couldn't leave her here. Predators would find her by nightfall. Taking her back to his camp would add miles to her journey to safety and proper care. With a resigned sigh, Quentin returned to Storm and adjusted his saddle bags, redistributing the weight. Then, with surprising gentleness for his large, calloused hands, He lifted the unconscious woman and placed her securely in front of his saddle. Mounting behind her, he cradled her body against his chest to keep her from falling. "Looks like we're making a detour, Storm," he said, nudging the horse forward. "Lincoln it is." The weight of the stranger pressed against him was unfamiliar. Quentin had spent years avoiding unnecessary human contact. Yet as they rode, he found himself unconsciously adjusting his posture to make her more comfortable, shielding her face from the sun with the brim of his hat. 20 miles. It would be a long journey carrying precious, unexpected cargo. But as he settled into the rhythm of Storm's steady gait, Quentin Irving made no complaint. The frontier had taught him that survival sometimes meant sharing your strength when others had none left to give. Elizabeth stirred briefly as the horse's movement jostled her. Her eyelids fluttered open to reveal deep brown eyes, clouded with confusion and pain. "Water," she whispered, her voice a ragged thread. "Here," Quentin said, his own voice rough from disuse. He brought the canteen to her lips again, supporting her head with one hand. She drank greedily before her eyes rolled back, and she slipped once more into unconsciousness. Quentin frowned. Her condition was worse than he'd initially thought. He nudged Storm into a faster pace, careful not to jostle his passenger too much. The sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the prairie. Quentin had traveled these routes enough times to know they wouldn't reach Lincoln before nightfall. He would need to make camp, but first he needed to find water. After another hour's ride, he spotted a stand of cottonwoods in the distance, a sure sign of water. He steered Storm toward it, relieved to discover a small creek winding through the trees. It was the perfect place to rest. Quentin dismounted carefully, supporting Elizabeth's limp form before gently lowering her to the ground beneath the dappled shade of a large cottonwood. He removed his coat and folded it into a makeshift pillow for her head. Then he unsaddled Storm, allowing the horse to drink and graze while he gathered wood for a small fire. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly, the harsh reality of prairie nights. Quentin built up the fire and tended to Elizabeth, whose feverish skin now felt cooler to the touch. He dampened his bandana in the creek and placed it on her forehead, then prepared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. The crackling fire cast dancing shadows across her face as Quentin watched her breathe. Who was this woman, and what had driven her to push herself to collapse? She wore no wedding ring, and her clothing, though trail-worn, was of good quality. A lady of means, perhaps, but what business could have brought her out here alone? "Where am I?" Elizabeth's voice startled him from his thoughts. Her eyes, clearer now, darted frantically around the campsite before settling on him with undisguised fear. "You're safe, miss," Quentin said, keeping his distance to avoid frightening her further. "I found you collapsed on the trail about 10 miles back. We're headed to Lincoln, but needed to stop for the night." She attempted to sit up but immediately winced, pressing a hand to her temple. "Who are you?" Quentin Irving, trail boss with the J-Bar outfit, was heading back from a cattle drive when I spotted you. He offered her the canteen again. "Drink slow this time." Elizabeth accepted it with trembling hands, heeding his advice. "Elizabeth Roseworth," she replied after a moment, her voice stronger. "I was traveling with the Henderson wagon train. I went to collect herbs while they watered the oxen, and I must have wandered too far. When I tried to return, they were gone." "The Hendersons don't have a reputation for waiting," Quentin remarked dryly. "They're known for keeping strict time. Likely they assumed you'd catch up or were with another family." "I have no family with me," Elizabeth said quietly, lowering her gaze. "I'm traveling alone to take a teaching position in Lincoln." Quentin's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's mighty brave for an Eastern lady." "I had little choice," she replied, a flash of steel in her eyes despite her weakened state. "And I'm from Philadelphia, not some delicate hothouse flower who's never seen hardship." A smile tugged at the corner of Quentin's mouth, quickly suppressed. "Never suggested you were, Miss Roseworth, just noting it takes courage to make this journey, especially alone." The fire crackled between them as an uneasy silence fell. Elizabeth studied her unlikely rescuer in the flickering light. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered by sun and wind, with a strong jawline partially obscured by several days' worth of stubble. His eyes, however, surprised her. They were a clear, intelligent blue that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. "I should thank you," she finally said, "for your assistance. I imagine I would have." She didn't finish the sentence, the reality of her narrow escape suddenly overwhelming. "No need for thanks," Quentin replied, turning to tend the fire. "Anyone would have done the same." "We both know that isn't true," Elizabeth said softly. "Not everyone would burden themselves with an unconscious stranger, especially not on these trails." Quentin merely shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "You should eat something if you can manage it. We have another long day ahead tomorrow." He passed her a piece of jerky and some hardtack, which she accepted gratefully. The food was plain but revived her spirits somewhat. "How far to Lincoln?" she asked between careful bites. "About 15 miles still. We'll reach it by mid-afternoon tomorrow if we start at first light." Elizabeth nodded, calculating what this meant for her plans. "The school term begins in 3 days. I should still arrive in time to prepare." She paused. "Mr. Irving, I have no way to repay you for your trouble, but there's nothing to repay," he interrupted firmly. "Get some rest, Miss Roseworth. Dawn comes early out here." With that, he moved to the other side of the fire and stretched out on his bedroll, hat pulled low over his eyes, effectively ending the conversation. Elizabeth watched him for a moment, bemused by his brusque manner yet undeniably grateful for his presence. The night sounds of the prairie surrounded them, crickets chirping, the occasional distant howl of a coyote, and the soft nickering of storm as he grazed nearby. Despite her ordeal, she felt strangely safe in this small circle of firelight with her taciturn rescuer standing guard. Sleep came more easily than she expected, her exhausted body surrendering to much-needed rest. Dawn broke in a spectacular display of pink and gold streaks across the eastern sky. Quentin had already rekindled the fire and was brewing coffee in a small tin pot when Elizabeth awakened. She sat up slowly, testing her strength, and was relieved to find that while sore, she felt markedly improved from the previous day. "Morning," Quentin greeted her, his voice still rough with sleep. "Coffee's almost ready. It's strong, but it'll help you regain your strength." "Thank you," Elizabeth replied, smoothing her tangled hair as best she could before retying her bonnet. She was acutely aware of her disheveled appearance but determined to maintain whatever dignity remained. Quentin poured the dark liquid into a tin cup and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed briefly during the exchange, and Elizabeth was surprised by the unexpected warmth that shot through her arm at the contact. She quickly attributed it to the heat of the cup. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the task of packing up his few belongings. "Better than I expected to," she admitted, "though I confess I'm eager to reach Lincoln and perhaps find a proper bath." A hint of a smile crossed Quentin's face before he turned away. "We'll get you there. Think you can ride today? You'll have to sit in front of me again." Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks at the prospect of such close proximity to this man, a virtual stranger, despite the unusual circumstances that had thrown them together. But practicality outweighed propriety in the wilderness. "I believe I can manage," she said with as much composure as she could muster. After a simple breakfast of the remaining hardtack, Quentin helped Elizabeth to her feet. She swayed slightly but remained standing, determined not to appear weak. He saddled Storm efficiently, then turned to her with an expectant look. "I'll lift you up first, then mount behind you," he explained. Before she could respond, his hands were at her waist, and she found herself being hoisted effortlessly onto the saddle. Moments later, he swung up behind her, his chest a solid presence against her back as he reached around her for the reins. "Ready?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. Elizabeth nodded, unable to find her voice as they set off at a steady pace toward Lincoln, the rising sun warming their backs. As the morning wore on, Elizabeth gradually relaxed into the rhythm of the horse's movement and the security of Quentin's arms around her. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, a sea of grasses and wildflowers swaying in the gentle breeze. Despite her precarious situation, she found herself struck by the raw beauty of the landscape. "It's quite magnificent, isn't it?" she remarked, breaking the companionable silence that had settled between them. "What's that?" Quentin asked, his attention momentarily diverted from scanning the horizon. "The prairie. It's so vast and open, different from anything I knew back east." He was quiet for a moment before responding. "Most folks only see the harshness of it at first, the dangers and difficulties. But yes, there's a beauty to it that gets into your blood after a while." "How long have you been out here?" Elizabeth asked, genuinely curious about this man who had saved her life. "Since I was 16, he replied. "Left home in Virginia after the war with Mexico. Needed to find my own way." 16, she echoed, trying to imagine him as a boy striking out alone into this wilderness. "That must have been difficult." Quentin shrugged, the movement shifting her slightly against him. "No harder than what many faced. Found work with cattle drives heading north, learned the trade, eventually worked my way up to trail boss." "And your family, do they know where you are?" A pause. "Parents passed on. Had a brother who fought in the Mexican War, never came home." Elizabeth's heart constricted at the matter-of-fact way he delivered this information. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "My parents died of influenza last winter. That's partly why I accepted the teaching position here. There was nothing left for me in Philadelphia." His arms seemed to tighten imperceptibly around her. "Seems we both know something about starting over then." They fell silent again, but something had shifted between them, a recognition of shared experience that transcended their different backgrounds. Around midday, they stopped briefly to rest Storm and stretch their legs. Elizabeth's muscles protested after hours in the saddle, but she was determined not to complain. Quentin offered her the last of their water and a piece of jerky, which she accepted gratefully. "We're making good time," he observed, gazing toward the horizon. "Should reach Lincoln within a few hours." Elizabeth nodded, suddenly struck by the realization that their journey would soon end. "What will you do once we reach town?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. Quentin seemed equally surprised. "Need to rejoin my men eventually. They're waiting at camp before heading back to Texas, but I'll stay in Lincoln long enough to see you settled." "That's very kind, but not necessary," Elizabeth said quickly, though the thought of facing a strange town alone again was daunting. "You've already done far more than could be expected." "It's no trouble," he replied simply, helping her back onto Storm. "Besides, wouldn't feel right just dropping you at the edge of town after all this." As they resumed their journey, Elizabeth found herself conflicted. The proper thing would be to insist on managing on her own from here, to not impose further on this man's generosity. Yet there was a comfort in his steady presence that she was reluctant to relinquish so soon. The afternoon sun was beginning its westward arc when they crested a small rise, and Lincoln came into view in the distance, a growing collection of wooden buildings nestled alongside the winding path of Salt Creek. Smoke rose from chimneys, and even from this distance they could make out the movement of people and wagons along the main street. "There it is," Quentin announced. "Your new home." Elizabeth felt a flutter of anxiety mixed with anticipation. After days of travel and yesterday's near disaster, the sight of civilization was welcome indeed. Yet as they approached the outskirts of town, she became increasingly aware that her time with Quentin Irving was drawing to a close, a fact that troubled her more than it logically should. Lincoln bustled with activity as they rode down the main street. Elizabeth was conscious of the curious stares directed their way. A disheveled woman sharing a horse with a trail-worn cowboy was hardly an everyday sight, even in a frontier town accustomed to unusual arrivals. "The school should be near the church," she said, remembering the details from her correspondence with the town council. "And they mentioned arranging lodging for me with a Mrs. Calloway until I find more permanent accommodations." Quentin nodded, guiding Storm toward the white steeple visible at the north end of town. As they approached, Elizabeth spotted a modest wooden building adjacent to the church, its fresh paint and large windows marking it as the schoolhouse. Outside stood a stout woman in a crisp apron, sweeping the porch with vigorous strokes. She looked up at the sound of hoofbeats, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern as she took in Elizabeth's bedraggled appearance. "Mrs. Calloway." Elizabeth called hopefully as Quentin brought Storm to a halt. The woman squinted at them. "Who's asking?" "I'm Elizabeth Roseworth, the new school teacher. I believe you were expecting me." Recognition dawned on the older woman's face. "Land's sakes, child. We thought you might have been lost to the prairie when you didn't arrive with the Henderson train yesterday." She hurried down the steps, setting aside her broom. "Simmons at the general store said they reported you'd wandered off and never returned." Quentin dismounted first, then reached up to help Elizabeth down. Her legs wobbled traitorously as they touched the ground, and his hands lingered at her waist to steady her. "Miss Roseworth encountered some difficulty on the trail," he explained with characteristic understatement. "She needed assistance to reach town." Mrs. Calloway's shrewd eyes assessed them both, lingering on Quentin's protective stance beside Elizabeth. "I can see that," she said, her tone softening. "Well, you're here now, and that's what matters. Come inside, dear. You look like you could use a good meal and a hot bath." Elizabeth turned to Quentin, suddenly at a loss for words. How did one properly thank a man who had carried you 20 miles across the prairie and quite literally saved your life? "Mr. Irving, Miss Roseworth requires rest and medical attention," he interrupted, addressing Mrs. Calloway rather than meeting Elizabeth's gaze. "She collapsed from heat exhaustion yesterday and has been without proper sustenance for at least a day." Mrs. Calloway clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "We'll set that right quick enough. The doctor's just 2 doors down if needed." She gestured toward her house. "You're welcome to come in as well, Mr. Irving. Least we can do is offer you a meal for your trouble." Quentin shook his head. "Appreciate the offer, madam, but I should see to my horse and find lodging for the night." His eyes finally met Elizabeth's. "Good luck with your teaching, Miss Roseworth." Before she could respond, he had mounted Storm and with a brief tip of his hat was riding back toward the center of town. Elizabeth stared after him, an unexpected hollowness forming in her chest. It seemed wrong somehow that he should simply ride away after all they had shared. "Well," Mrs. Calloway said, breaking into her thoughts, "that's a man of few words if I ever saw one. Handsome, though, in that rugged way." She gave Elizabeth a sidelong glance. "Quite the entrance you've made to our little town, Miss Roseworth." Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks. "It's not we didn't," Mrs. Calloway patted her arm. No need to explain, dear. Life out here doesn't always follow the rules of Eastern propriety. Now come along before you collapse again. You look dead on your feet. Following her new landlady inside, Elizabeth cast one last glance down the street, but Quentin had already disappeared from view. The Calloway home was modest but meticulously kept, with clean muslin curtains at the windows and a polished wooden floor that gleamed in the late afternoon light. Mrs. Calloway Mabel. As she insisted, Elizabeth call her efficiently prepared a bath in a copper tub behind a screen in the kitchen, heating kettles of water on the large cast iron stove. "You soak as long as you need, dear," Mabel said, laying out a clean nightgown and robe. "They're my daughter's, but she's married and living in Omaha now. Should fit you well enough until we can retrieve your belongings." "My trunk," Elizabeth gasped, suddenly remembering. "It was with the Henderson wagon. All my clothes, my books, my teaching materials." "Don't you fret about that now," Mabel assured her. "My Henry, that's Mr. Calloway, is on the town council. He'll make sure your things are located and brought to you. The Hendersons likely left them at the general store when they reported you missing." Relieved, Elizabeth sank into the bath, the warm water soothing her aching muscles and sunburned skin. As she washed away the dust of the trail, her thoughts kept returning to Quentin. His quiet strength, the gentle way he had cared for her despite his gruff exterior, the security she had felt in his arms during their long ride to Lincoln. It was foolish, she knew, to dwell on a man she had known for barely a day and would likely never see again. He had his own life, his own path that led far from this place. Yet something about him had touched her in a way no man ever had. After her bath, Elizabeth ate the hearty stew Mabel provided, then retired to the small guest room, falling into an exhausted sleep almost as soon as her head touched the pillow. Her dreams were filled with endless prairie skies and the rhythmic motion of a horse beneath her, strong arms holding her safe against the dangers of the wilderness. Morning brought renewed energy and the realization that her new life in Lincoln was beginning in earnest. Dr. Emerson, summoned by the concerned Mrs. Calloway, pronounced her remarkably recovered from her ordeal but advised another day of rest before taking up her teaching duties. "You're fortunate that Cowboy found you when he did," the doctor remarked as he packed away his stethoscope. "Another night exposed on the prairie, and we might be having a very different conversation." "Yes," Elizabeth agreed quietly. "I owe him my life." By afternoon, her trunk had been delivered, allowing her to change into her own clothes, a simple navy dress that was one of the few practical garments she had brought from Philadelphia. Feeling more like herself, she asked Mabel for directions to the hotel where travelers typically stayed in Lincoln. "Planning to call on your rescuer?" Mabel asked with a knowing smile. Elizabeth straightened her shoulders. "I merely wish to thank him properly. He departed rather abruptly yesterday." "The trail's end is just past the bank," Mabel said. "Most cowboys and cattle drivers stay there when passing through. Though I should warn you, Miss Roseworth, a respectable young lady calling on a man at his hotel, might raise eyebrows, even in Lincoln." "I am merely expressing gratitude to the man who saved my life," Elizabeth replied firmly. "I believe even the strictest arbiter of propriety would allow that." Mabel's eyes twinkled. "As you say, dear, just be careful. Men like that, the wandering kind, they don't usually stay in one place for long." With her landlady's warning echoing in her mind, Elizabeth made her way down Lincoln's Main Street. The town was larger than she had initially thought, with several blocks of businesses catering to both local residents and those passing through on their way further west. The Trail's End Hotel was a two-story wooden structure with a wide porch and swinging doors leading to what appeared to be a saloon on one side. Elizabeth hesitated at the entrance, suddenly unsure of her decision. What if Quentin had already left? Or worse, what if he thought her forward for seeking him out? Perhaps he had been relieved to be rid of his burden once they reached town. As she stood there debating, the hotel doors swung open, and a familiar tall figure emerged, adjusting his hat against the bright afternoon sunlight. Quentin stopped short when he saw her, genuine surprise registering on his usually impassive face. "Miss Roseworth," he said, removing his hat. "Didn't expect to see you up and about so soon." Elizabeth clasped her hands in front of her to still their slight trembling. "Mr. Irving, I'm glad I caught you. I wanted to thank you properly for what you did. I realize now I never truly expressed my gratitude yesterday." He shifted uncomfortably, his hat rotating slowly in his hands. "No need for that." "There is every need," she insisted. "Doctor Emerson says I likely wouldn't have survived another night on the prairie. You saved my life, Mr. Irving, at great inconvenience to yourself." Quentin glanced around, seemingly conscious of the curious glances they were attracting from passers-by. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere less public," he suggested. "There's a cafe down the street that serves decent coffee." Elizabeth nodded, relief flooding through her that he wasn't immediately dismissing her. They walked side by side down the boardwalk, an awkward silence stretching between them until they reached Millie's Cafe, a cheerful establishment with checkered curtains and the aroma of fresh baked pie wafting from its open door. Once seated at a small table near the window, with cups of steaming coffee before them, Quentin seemed to relax slightly. In the clear light of day, Elizabeth could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes and a small scar along his jawline that she hadn't noticed before. "You're looking better today," he observed. "Color's back in your cheeks." "I feel much improved," she replied. "Mrs. Calloway has been very kind, and I understand the town council retrieved my trunk from the Henderson wagon train, so I haven't lost all my possessions after all." Quentin nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "That's good news." Another silence fell, less awkward but filled with unspoken questions. Finally, Elizabeth gathered her courage to ask what she really wanted to know. "Will you be leaving Lincoln soon, Mrs. Calloway mentioned that trail bosses typically don't linger in town." "Need to rejoin my men," he confirmed. "They're waiting at our camp about 10 miles south. We'll head back to Texas once I return." "I see," Elizabeth said, trying to mask her disappointment. "When do you plan to leave?" Quentin studied her for a moment, his blue eyes unreadable. "Was planning to ride out today. Got my business concluded in town." "Of course," she said quickly. "I wouldn't want to delay you. I just wanted to," she paused, reaching into her reticule. "I wanted to give you this." She placed a small object on the table between them, a silver pin in the shape of an open book, with tiny engraved letters spelling "Knowledge is Light." "It was a gift from my father when I completed my teacher training," she explained. "I know it's not much, but I wanted you to have something to remember." She stopped, flushing slightly. "That is, something to show my gratitude." Quentin stared at the pin, making no move to take it. "That's a family keepsake, Miss Roseworth. I couldn't possibly accept it." "Please," she said softly. "It would mean a great deal to me if you would. I have so little to offer in return for what you did." Slowly, he reached out and picked up the pin, his calloused fingers incongruously gentle as he examined it. "Never had much schooling myself," he admitted. "Learned to read from my mother, but that was about it." "You seem very well spoken for a man with little formal education," Elizabeth observed. A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Read when I can. Pick up books in towns we pass through." Not much else to do on long cattle drives besides watch the stars and read by firelight. This glimpse into his private world intrigued Elizabeth. There was clearly more to Quentin Irving than the stoic cowboy exterior he presented to the world. "What kind of books do you enjoy?" she asked. He seemed embarrassed by the question. "History mostly, some poetry, anything I can get my hands on, really." Elizabeth's heart warmed at this confession. "I've brought quite a collection with me for the school. You'd be welcome to borrow something before you leave." Quentin tucked the pin carefully into his vest pocket. "That's kind of you to offer." He hesitated, then added, "Actually, I was thinking of staying one more day. Horace could use the rest." "Oh." Elizabeth tried to contain the surge of pleasure this news brought. "Then perhaps you would consider joining me for dinner tonight. Mrs. Calloway has invited several members of the town council to welcome me, and I'm sure they would be interested to hear the account of our journey from your perspective." Quentin's brow furrowed. "Not much for social gatherings, Miss Roseworth. Please," she said, impulsively reaching across the table to touch his hand. "It would mean a lot to me, and I think Mrs. Calloway is making apple pie." At the mention of pie, something in his expression softened. "Well, when you put it that way." "What time should I arrive?" Elizabeth beamed. 7 o'clock, and—" She paused, suddenly shy. "You might call me Elizabeth, after all we've been through." He met her gaze directly for the first time since they'd sat down. "Elizabeth," he repeated, her name sounding different somehow in his deep voice. "Then I suppose you should call me Quentin." The connection between them in that moment was palpable, a current of understanding that transcended the brief time they had known each other. Elizabeth felt her cheeks warm under his steady gaze and withdrew her hand from his, suddenly conscious of how forward she had been. "I should let you return to your business," she said, rising from her chair. "And I need to prepare for my first look at the schoolhouse this afternoon." Quentin stood as well, towering over her in the small cafe. "Until this evening, then." As Elizabeth walked back to the Calloway home, her step was lighter than it had been in months. She told herself it was simply the pleasure of having properly thanked her rescuer, of having fulfilled that social obligation. But in her heart, she knew it was more than that. Against all reason, in the span of 2 days, Quentin Irving had become someone she wasn't ready to say goodbye to just yet. The afternoon passed in a blur as Elizabeth toured the schoolhouse with Mr. Henry Calloway, a kindly older gentleman with bushy white whiskers and intelligent eyes. The building was newer than she had expected, with rows of wooden desks facing a larger teacher's desk and blackboard. Shelves lined one wall, ready to be filled with the books she had brought and others the town council had ordered from back east. "We have about 20 children enrolled so far," Mr. Calloway explained, "ages 6 to 14. Some of the older boys only attend in the winter months when they're not needed on their family farms." Elizabeth nodded, already making mental notes about how to organize lessons for such a wide age range. "And when does the term officially begin?" "Monday next," he replied. "Gives you a few days to settle in and prepare. The previous teacher left some notes and primers you might find useful." He gestured to a drawer in the desk. As they walked back toward the Calloway home, Elizabeth gathered her courage to ask about the dinner that evening. "Mrs. Calloway mentioned you're having some guests tonight to welcome me," she began. "I hope you won't mind that I've invited one more Mr. Irving, the gentleman who helped me reach Lincoln safely." Mr. Calloway's bushy eyebrows rose slightly. "The Cowboy. Interesting company for a school teacher." When Elizabeth stiffened, he quickly added, "No offense meant, Miss Roseworth. We're grateful to the man for bringing you to us safely, just not the usual sort we see at dinner parties." "There was nothing usual about our journey here," Elizabeth replied with more sharpness than she intended. "Mr. Irving carried me for 20 miles after I collapsed from exhaustion. He could have left me to die on the prairie, as the Henderson wagon train apparently did, but instead, He sacrificed his own comfort and safety for a complete stranger. I believe that makes him worthy of dinner in any company." Mr. Calloway looked taken aback by her vehemence, but then chuckled. "I see Lincoln has gained a schoolteacher with spirit as well as education. Very well, Miss Roseworth. Mr. Irving will be most welcome at our table." Back at the house, Elizabeth found herself growing increasingly anxious as the evening approached. She changed into her best dress, a forest green silk with modest lace trim at the collar and cuffs, and arranged her hair in a simple but elegant style. As she pinned the last strand in place, she caught herself wondering what Quentin would think of her appearance, then immediately chastised herself for such schoolgirl thoughts. He was leaving tomorrow. This dinner was merely a proper conclusion to their brief acquaintance, a way to integrate her unusual arrival into the social fabric of her new community. Nothing more. Yet when the knock came at precisely 7 o'clock, and she hurried to the door before Mrs. Calloway could reach it, Elizabeth's heart was racing in a most improper manner. Quentin stood on the porch, hat in hand, his usual trail clothes replaced by what appeared to be his only good shirt and a clean vest. His dark hair was still damp from what must have been a recent bath, and the scent of bay rum aftershave subtly replaced the familiar smell of leather and horses that she had come to associate with him. Most surprising of all, he had shaved, revealing a strong jawline usually hidden behind stubble. "Good evening," he said formally, his eyes taking in her appearance with an appreciative glance so brief she almost missed it. "Good evening, Quentin," she replied, stepping back to allow him entry. "I'm so glad you could join us." Mrs. Calloway appeared behind her, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Irving, welcome. I was just telling Henry how remarkable it is that you found our Miss Roseworth out there in all that emptiness. Providence must have been watching over her, sending you her way just when she needed help most." "Lucky timing is all," Quentin replied modestly, handing Elizabeth a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Brought something for you." Elizabeth unwrapped it to find a leather-bound journal with blank pages, its cover tooled with a simple design of prairie wildflowers. "Thought you might want to record your adventures in your new home," he explained, looking somewhat embarrassed by Mrs. Calloway's delighted exclamation over the gift. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth said sincerely, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you." Before the moment could become awkward, Mr. Calloway emerged from his study with two other couples, the town doctor and his wife, whom Elizabeth had met earlier, and the Reverend and Mrs. Peterson, who operated the church adjacent to the schoolhouse. Dinner was a pleasant affair, with Mrs. Calloway's excellent cooking and easy conversation flowing around the table. Elizabeth observed Quentin carefully, noticing how he hung back from the discussion, answering questions directed to him politely, but briefly. Yet he seemed to be listening intently to everything, his eyes often resting on Elizabeth when others were speaking, gauging her reactions. The conversation inevitably turned to their dramatic journey to Lincoln. "Mr. Irving, you must tell us how you found Miss Roseworth," Mrs. Peterson urged. "It sounds like something from a dime novel." All eyes turned to Quentin, who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the attention. "Not much to tell," he said with a shrug. "Was riding ahead of my men, spotted something unusual on the trail, turned out to be Miss Roseworth." "He's being far too modest," Elizabeth interjected. "I was unconscious, severely dehydrated, and would have died there if he hadn't found me. He not only revived me but carried me for 20 miles to reach Lincoln, making camp overnight when it grew too dark to continue." 20 miles with an unconscious woman, Dr. Emerson exclaimed. "That's no small feat, Irving." "She didn't weigh much," Quentin replied, a hint of color rising in his face, "and my horse did most of the work." Still, Many men would have considered it too much trouble, Reverend Peterson observed, or might have behaved less honorably, finding a young woman alone and vulnerable. The implication hung in the air, causing Elizabeth to stiffen and Quentin's jaw to tighten. "Some men aren't worth the name, then," Quentin said quietly but firmly. "Where I come from, you don't leave someone to die if you can help them, and you treat a lady with respect regardless of circumstances." An awkward silence followed, broken by Mrs. Calloway brightly announcing it was time for apple pie. As she bustled to the kitchen, Elizabeth caught Quentin's eye across the table and mouthed, "Thank you," hoping he understood she appreciated his defense of both their characters. After dessert, the party moved to the parlor for coffee. Elizabeth found herself seated next to Mrs. Peterson, who leaned in to speak confidentially. "He's quite handsome, your cowboy," the Reverend's wife whispered, "and clearly devoted to you to have gone to such lengths." "He's not my cowboy," Elizabeth protested quietly. "We were strangers until 2 days ago. He's leaving for Texas tomorrow." Mrs. Peterson patted her hand. "If you say so, dear. But I've been watching him all evening and he's barely taken his eyes off you. That's not the look of a man eager to ride away." Elizabeth glanced across the room to where Quentin stood in conversation with Dr. Emerson, his posture stiff but polite. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, their eyes meeting briefly before she quickly turned her attention back to Mrs. Peterson. "You're mistaken," Elizabeth insisted, though her heart beat faster at the suggestion. "Mr. Irving was simply doing his duty as any decent man would." "Of course," Mrs. Peterson said with a knowing smile that suggested she believed nothing of the sort. The evening drew to a close around 9 o'clock, the guests departing with warm wishes for Elizabeth's success as Lincoln's new schoolteacher. Quentin was the last to leave, lingering at the door as the Calloways tactfully withdrew to give them privacy. "Thank you for coming tonight," Elizabeth said, suddenly shy. "I know it wasn't your usual sort of gathering." "Was worth it for the pie," he replied with the ghost of a smile. Then, more seriously, "You'll do well here, Elizabeth. They seem like good people." "Yes, I think so too," she hesitated. "What time do you leave tomorrow, First Light?" His expression was unreadable in the dim light of the porch. Elizabeth nodded, swallowing against the unexpected lump in her throat. "Then I suppose this is goodbye." Quentin studied her face for a long moment, as if committing it to memory. "Reckon it is." He started to turn away, then paused. "That book you mentioned, the one I might borrow, don't suppose you have it handy?" Her spirits lifted slightly. "Yes, of course. Wait here." She hurried to her room and returned with a slim volume of Wordsworth's poetry. "It's one of my favorites," she explained, handing it to him. "You can return it someday." His fingers brushed hers as he took the book, sending that same inexplicable warmth through her arm. "Might be a while before I pass through Lincoln again," he said softly. "I understand." She tried to keep disappointment from her voice. "Safe travels, Quentin." He nodded once, placing his hat back on his head. "Good night, Elizabeth." She watched him walk down the street until his tall figure disappeared into the darkness, then closed the door and leaned against it, pressing the journal he had given her to her chest. This strange sadness made no sense. They had known each other only 2 days. Yet somehow, the thought of never seeing him again left an emptiness inside her that she couldn't explain. Dawn found Elizabeth wide awake, having slept poorly. Without conscious decision, she dressed quickly and made her way through the quiet streets toward the Trail's End Hotel. She told herself she merely wanted to wish Quentin a safe journey, perhaps thank him once more for the lovely journal. But as she approached the hotel and saw him leading Storm from the adjacent livery stable, saddlebags packed and ready for the trail, she knew she had come for more than that. He spotted her when she was still some distance away, his expression changing from surprise to something warmer as she approached. "Didn't expect to see you this early," he said, adjusting Storm's saddle. "I wanted to see you off properly," Elizabeth replied, feeling suddenly foolish. "And to wish you safe travels," Quentin nodded, his eyes studying her face intently. "Appreciate that." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unspoken words. Finally, Elizabeth gathered her courage. "When do you think you might pass through Lincoln again?" she asked, trying to sound casual. He considered the question seriously. "Hard to say. Cattle drives follow the seasons. Might be back this way in the spring, depending on the route we take." "I see." Elizabeth twisted her hands together nervously. Perhaps you might write. Just to let me know you're well. After all, I did entrust you with my favorite book of poetry." A slow smile spread across Quentin's face, transforming his features in a way that made Elizabeth's heart skip a beat. "I could do that," he paused. "Would like that, actually." Hope blossomed in her chest. "Really, really." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the various shades of blue in his eyes, like the prairie sky at different times of day. "Elizabeth, I'm not good with words, not like your poets, but these past 2 days—" He trailed off, seemingly at a loss. "I know," she said softly. "I've felt it too." His hand reached up tentatively to touch her cheek, calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I have to go back to Texas. It's my job, my responsibility to the men who depend on me. But I can't stop thinking about you. It doesn't make any sense." "No, it doesn't," she agreed, leaning slightly into his touch. "We barely know each other." "I know you're brave," he said, his voice low and intense. "I know you're determined enough to travel alone across half the country to build a new life. I know you care about books and learning and sharing that with others. I know you're beautiful, especially when you're telling off some town councilman for suggesting I'm not fit company for dinner." Elizabeth's eyes widened. "You heard that," he nodded, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Was waiting on the porch. You have quite a spirited defense, schoolteacher." She blushed but didn't look away. "It was the truth. You're the most honorable man I've ever met, Quentin Irving. You carried me 20 miles without a single complaint, even though I was a burden and a delay to your plans." "Never thought of you as a burden," he said quietly, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. "Thought of you as a miracle, actually. Something precious found in the wilderness when I least expected it." Elizabeth's breath caught at his words. This rough cowboy with his poetic soul was unlike anyone she had ever known, and the thought of letting him ride away now seemed unbearable. "I don't want to say goodbye," she whispered. "Then don't." His eyes searched hers, seeking permission for what they both wanted. Elizabeth answered by rising on tiptoe, her hands resting lightly on his chest as she pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but deepened as Quentin's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer. The world around them faded the early morning bustle of the town, the occasional whinny from Storm, the propriety that dictated that a schoolteacher shouldn't be kissing a cowboy on a public street at dawn. None of it mattered in that moment. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. "That complicates things," he murmured, though he was smiling. "Life is complicated," Elizabeth replied, "but sometimes the most unexpected journeys lead us exactly where we're meant to be." He straightened, his expression becoming serious. "I still have to go, Elizabeth. My men are waiting and we have contracts to fulfill in Texas." "I know," she said, though her heart ached at the words. "And I have a school term beginning on Monday. We each have our responsibilities." Quentin took her hands in his grip warm and sure. "But I'll write. And I'll come back to Lincoln as soon as I can. That's a promise." "I'll hold you to it," Elizabeth said, trying to smile through the tears that threatened. And I'll be here, teaching my students and waiting for a certain cowboy poet to return." He kissed her once more, briefly but tenderly, before mounting storm. "Take care of yourself, Elizabeth Roseworth. Try not to collapse from exhaustion again before I get back." She laughed despite herself. "I'll do my best. Safe travels, Quentin Irving." With a final tip of his hat, he turned Storm toward the southern trail and rode away, the rising sun casting his shadow long across the street. Elizabeth watched until he disappeared from view, her heart both heavy with his departure and light with the promise of his return. As she walked back to the Calloway home, Elizabeth opened the journal he had given her and began to compose her first entry. Their story had only just begun. She was certain of it. The weeks turned to months as autumn gave way to winter in Lincoln. Elizabeth threw herself into her teaching with enthusiasm and determination, quickly earning the respect of both her students and their parents. The schoolhouse became a second home to her, and she took pride in watching young minds blossom under her guidance. True to his word, Quentin wrote regularly, his letters arriving every few weeks via the postal service that connected Lincoln to larger towns along the cattle routes. His penmanship was surprisingly elegant for a man with little formal education, and while his early letters were brief and factual, they gradually grew more expressive as he became comfortable sharing his thoughts on paper. Elizabeth treasured each letter, reading and rereading them in the evenings by lamplight. She learned about his life on the trail, the camaraderie among the cowboys, the challenges of driving cattle across rivers and difficult terrain, the peaceful nights under star-filled skies. In return, she wrote to him about her students, the growing community of Lincoln, and her thoughts on the books they were both reading, as Quentin had taken to visiting bookshops in the larger towns he passed through. As winter deepened, bringing snow and bitter winds to the Nebraska prairie, Elizabeth found herself watching the southern horizon whenever she walked to and from school, though she knew it was too soon to expect Quentin's return. His last letter had indicated that he would remain in Texas until at least March, when the spring cattle drives would begin. Christmas came and went, celebrated with the Calloways and her new friends in Lincoln. Elizabeth had become a valued member of the community, participating in church socials, town meetings, and the various gatherings that helped the isolated settlement maintain its spirits during the long winter months. In early February, a package arrived for her, a birthday gift from Quentin, though she had mentioned her February 12th birthday only once in passing. Inside was a delicate silver pendant in the shape of a book, its cover etched with her initials. The accompanying note was brief but treasured. "Elizabeth, saw this in San Antonio and thought of you. May have to miss your birthday this year, but not in spirit. Thinking of you under these Texas stars. Yours, Quentin." The yours made her heart skip a beat each time she read it. It was the first time he had signed that way, a small but significant shift in how he expressed his feelings. As February gave way to March, bringing the first tentative signs of spring to Nebraska, Elizabeth found herself increasingly distracted, her thoughts often drifting southward during lessons. Her students noticed her occasional lapses of attention, especially Molly Jenkins, a precocious 12-year-old who had appointed herself Elizabeth's confidante. "Are you watching for Mr. Irving again, Miss Roseworth?" Molly asked one afternoon as they walked from the schoolhouse together, the girl carrying a stack of readers Elizabeth had lent her. Elizabeth startled, then smiled ruefully. "Is it that obvious?" Molly nodded solemnly. "You always look south when you think no one's watching." "My ma says it's right romantic, you waiting for your cowboy to come back." "He's not my cowboy," Elizabeth protested automatically, though the denial had grown weaker with each passing month. "If you say so, Miss Roseworth," Molly replied with all the worldly wisdom of her 12 years. But Ma says a man doesn't ride 20 miles carrying a woman he doesn't care for special like. Elizabeth couldn't argue with that logic, especially when her own heart told her the same thing. Each letter from Quentin had only strengthened the inexplicable bond that had formed between them during those intense 2 days. What had begun as gratitude and admiration had deepened into something far more profound, something she now acknowledged, at least to herself, as love. But would it be enough? Could a school teacher with roots newly planted in a growing community, and a wandering cowboy with the open trail in his blood, truly find a way forward together? These questions haunted Elizabeth as March progressed with no word from Quentin in nearly 3 weeks, the longest silence since he had left Lincoln. Then, on the first truly warm day of spring, as Elizabeth was dismissing her students for the day, a commotion outside drew their attention. The children rushed to the windows, pointing and exclaiming, "Miss Roseworth, there's a whole herd of cattle coming." Young Jimmy Cooper called out excitedly. Elizabeth's heart leapt as she moved to the window. Sure enough, a sizable herd was moving slowly along the edge of town, guided by several mounted cowboys, and at their head, astride a familiar dappled gray stallion, was a tall figure whose silhouette she would recognize anywhere. "Class dismissed," she announced, her voice betraying her excitement despite her attempt at composure. "Remember your arithmetic homework for tomorrow." The children scattered, most running toward the edge of town to watch the cattle drive, a thrilling spectacle in the normally quiet community. Elizabeth remained in the schoolhouse, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered her books and straightened her desk. She wanted desperately to run to Quentin immediately, but propriety demanded restraint. He would be busy with the herd for hours yet, getting them settled in the grazing lands north of town. She had almost convinced herself to walk calmly home when the schoolhouse door opened, and Quentin stood framed in the entrance, hat in hand, his tall form blocking the afternoon sunlight. "Hope I'm not interrupting your lessons," he said, his voice deeper and more resonant than she had remembered. "The students have just left," Elizabeth replied, her own voice not entirely steady. "I saw the herd arriving." "I didn't expect, wanted to surprise you," Quentin interrupted, taking a step into the room. "Changed our route to bring this drive through Lincoln. My men think I've lost my mind, adding 50 miles to our journey." Elizabeth moved from behind her desk, closing the distance between them. "And have you? Lost your mind, that is?" A slow smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes in a way that made her heart beat faster. "Completely. Been thinking of nothing but a certain school teacher for months now." "She must be very special indeed," Elizabeth teased, though her eyes shimmered with emotion. "She is." Quentin's expression grew serious as he reached out to take her hands in his. "Elizabeth, I've never been a man for settling in one place. The open trail has been my home since I was 16. But these past months, every mile I rode felt like it was taking me further from where I wanted to be." Elizabeth squeezed his hands, scarcely daring to breathe. "And where is that?" "Here," he said simply. "With you." The directness of his words, the raw emotion in his voice, brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes. "But your work, the cattle drives, I've been talking with my men," Quentin explained. "Davidson, he's my second, is ready to take over as trail boss, and there's a spread for sale just outside of Lincoln. Nothing fancy but good grazing land, a solid house. Might suit a man looking to raise horses instead of driving other men's cattle across the country." Elizabeth's eyes widened as she realized what he was saying. "You're thinking of staying here in Lincoln?" "I'm thinking of building a life," he corrected gently. "If that's something you might consider sharing." Joy bubbled up inside her, so intense she could barely contain it. Quentin Irving, are you proposing to me in my schoolhouse? He glanced around, suddenly looking boyishly uncertain. Reckon I am, though I didn't plan it this way. Was going to call on you properly at the Calloways, maybe take you for a ride to see the property first. But then I saw you standing here and I just couldn't wait another minute. He took a deep breath. Elizabeth Roseworth, I love you. Don't know exactly how it happened so fast, but I do know I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me? Elizabeth launched herself into his arms, nearly knocking him backward with the force of her embrace. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes, she exclaimed, laughing through her tears as he lifted her off her feet, spinning her around in the middle of the schoolroom. When he set her down, she looked up into his face, memorizing every detail: the weather-bronzed skin, the lines etched by sun and wind, the startling blue of his eyes, now dark with emotion. I love you too, Quentin. I think I have since you carried me 20 miles without a single complaint. He bent to kiss her then, a kiss that held all the longing of their months apart and all the promise of their future together. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. Still can't believe my luck, he murmured. Finding you collapsed on that trail was the best thing that ever happened to me. Elizabeth smiled, her heart overflowing with happiness. For me as well, though perhaps next time I'll try to meet a handsome cowboy without the near-death experience. His laughter filled the schoolhouse as he pulled her close again, and Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that their unexpected journey had led them exactly where they were meant to be. They were married 3 weeks later in the small white church, adjacent to Elizabeth's schoolhouse, with the entire town of Lincoln turning out to witness the union of their beloved schoolteacher and the cowboy who had carried her 20 miles to safety. Reverend Peterson performed the ceremony, beaming with satisfaction at having predicted their romance from the start. Elizabeth wore a simple gown of ivory silk that Mrs. Calloway had helped her sew, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Quentin, almost unrecognizable in a new black suit, looked equal parts terrified and elated as she walked down the aisle toward him. The reception was held in the schoolyard, with tables laden with food contributed by every family in town. There was dancing to fiddle music under the spring sunshine, children running and playing between the adults, and more genuine good wishes than either bride or groom had expected to receive in a lifetime. As the celebration continued into the evening, Quentin pulled Elizabeth away from the crowd, leading her to where Storm was tethered at the edge of the schoolyard. "Ready for another ride, Mrs. Irving?" he asked, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Always," she replied, laughing as he lifted her effortlessly onto the saddle before mounting behind her, his arms encircling her waist in a now familiar embrace. They rode in comfortable silence through the gathering twilight, following a path that led away from town and toward the rolling hills to the west. After about 15 minutes, they crested a small rise, and Elizabeth gasped at the sight before her. A modest but well-built farmhouse stood in a natural hollow, sheltered from the wind by a stand of cottonwoods. A barn and corral sat nearby, and in the fading light, she could make out several horses grazing in a fenced pasture. Lamplight glowed warmly from the windows of the house, welcoming them home. "What do you think?" Quentin asked, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. "It's not grand, but it's perfect," Elizabeth interrupted, turning in the saddle to look up at him. "Absolutely perfect." His smile was worth every hardship, every moment of doubt, every mile of their journey to this place and time. As he helped her down from Storm and carried her across the threshold of their new home, just as he had once carried her across the prairie, Elizabeth knew that this was merely the beginning of their greatest adventure yet. 5 years later, Elizabeth sat on the wide porch of their expanded farmhouse, watching as Quentin taught their 4-year-old son, James, to sit atop his first pony. Their 2-year-old daughter, Margaret, played contentedly at Elizabeth's feet, while the newest addition to the family, month-old Thomas, slept peacefully in her arms. The horse breeding business had flourished beyond their expectations, with Irving thoroughbreds developing a reputation for quality that spread throughout the Nebraska Territory and beyond. Elizabeth continued teaching at the schoolhouse 3 days a week, having arranged for a younger teacher to share the duties after James was born. Lincoln had grown as well, now boasting a proper bank, 2 hotels, several shops, and even a small library that Elizabeth had helped establish. The railroad had arrived 2 years earlier, bringing increased prosperity and connection to the wider world. Yet despite these changes, the community retained its close-knit character, with the Irvings playing an integral role in its development. As Quentin lifted James down from the pony and sent him running toward the porch with an excited, "Did you see me, Mama?" Elizabeth felt a wave of contentment wash over her. The journey that had begun with her collapse from exhaustion on a lonely trail had led to a life richer and more fulfilling than she could have imagined. Quentin climbed the porch steps, kissing her softly before taking a seat beside her and reaching out to let baby Thomas grasp his finger with surprising strength. "Thinking deep thoughts, Mrs. Irving?" he asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "Just counting my blessings," she replied, leaning against his shoulder. "Do you ever think about how differently our lives might have turned out if you hadn't happened to ride by when I collapsed that day?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I remember something my mother used to say, that there are no accidents in this life, just paths we don't understand until we've walked them." He smiled down at her, his eyes still holding the same warmth they had when he first proposed in her schoolhouse. "And I think she was right. Somehow, I believe we would have found each other eventually, even if you hadn't had to carry me 20 miles. Elizabeth teased, her eyes sparkling with humor and love. Quentin's laugh rumbled through his chest as he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "Even then. Though I have to say, it was worth every step." As the setting sun painted the Nebraska prairie in hues of gold and amber, the Irving family gathered on their porch, surrounded by the life they had built together, a life born from an unexpected encounter on a lonely trail, nurtured by patience and persistence, and sustained by a love that had only deepened with each passing day. And in the years that followed, when their children asked for the story of how their parents met, Quentin would always begin with the same words. "I found your mother collapsed from exhaustion on her journey to Lincoln. I carried her 20 miles to safety, and I never complained once because, from the moment I held her in my arms, I knew she was carrying my heart right back."